Staples. They're cards that every player needs to optimize their deck, especially if they wish to compete at higher levels of play. Card games have these in all sorts of forms, and Elestrals is no different. Thus, I wanted to put this video together discussing what I think are the staples out of Elestrals base set. How I determined these staples was through the usage data across all the constructed tournaments that have taken place up until March 9th of 2024. I'll be breaking down each of these cards into 3 separate categories. The first one discussing why I think it is a staple, the second one being the number of copies that is typically run across these competitive decks, and the third one will be a buyer's guide. I want to put a disclaimer here before getting into it, that these cards are, while in a particular order based off of usage, I don't think that is necessarily indicative of what order you should pick up these cards in. That can be very subjective based on your playstyle, the kind of decks you're wanting to playing, and a few other factors. So I think the best place to start, if you're wondering which ones you should prioritize, is just to ask in the Elestrals Discord server. It'll be linked down in the description below. You can even at me on the Discord, and my tag is Eagle the Duck. But let's get right into the first card I want to discuss here, and that is Nectar of the Gods. This card's quite simple. It's card advantage. It draws you 2 cards. Since you use up 1 card from your hand to play it, it is a +1 in net card advantage. It is just a general consistency boost. Digging 2 cards deep into your deck means that you're generally going to find your cards that you want to see more often, and because it's a +1, that means you just have more options in your hand to choose what to cast and what to play when. The average number of copies run per deck is 2, but that number is a bit misleading because really there seems to be one of 2 camps with Nectar of the Gods, that being the players who want to run 3 copies, maxing out, and the players that want to run 1 copy. And because there's those 2 extremes, it ends up averaging out to 2 copies. While I think deck archetype is a big factor of if you want to run 1 or 3, I also think the comparison to Pot of Greed is somewhat still influencing it and might influence it even more as the first edition drops and more players join the community. And it's an understandable why that comparison would be made, but there are a few factors to why that comparison doesn't exactly hold up. And that is because it costs 2 life, 2 of your resources, a 10th of the total if you cast it as your first card for the game. And while at the beginning of the game, that's not too big of a deal because it's only a 10th of your life, and now you have all like 2 additional options on what to cast, 1 card over your opponent. But as you start getting later into the game, maybe say you've got 4 spirits left, you top deck a Nectar of the Gods, it costs half your life just to be able to get 2 more cards. That 2 life could go into playing 1 or even 2 more cards, and that could be significant, especially if your opponent is ahead of you on spirits, even just 5 spirits, because now all of a sudden you're down to being able to play 1 to 2 more cards. Meanwhile, your opponent can easily have up to 5 still in them. So as such, it just kind of becomes a question of, is the consistency of finding Nog early worth potentially finding a dead card later in the game, or a card that probably will just cause you to run out of spirits a bit quicker? My opinion is no. My personal preference in a lot of my decks is just to run 1 Nectar of the Gods. If I see it, awesome. If I don't, oh well. At least now I'm less likely to find it later in the game when it's a brick, and if I find it earlier in the game, which less likely, sure, it still functions exactly how I want it to. Picking up 2 copies of this card I think is safe. I think there is some merit to run 2 copies, kind of that in between, but really, you can pick up a playset of 3 just to be safe, because I could see a time where the game is just so explosive that just finding that Nog early is actually worth it, and you're winning before you end up drawing into that brick anyway. Thankfully, this card is super easy to get with all the product out there, because each of the 5 starter decks includes at least 1 copy of this, as well as the booster set having a holo version, and we've got for first edition stellar blister packs of Nectar of the Gods, which means that you just buy 3 and you got your playset anyway. Real easy. I also fully expect this card to get a ton of reprints in the future just because it's a super generic and simple card. It seems like it's the perfect card, like the poster card, to get all those reprints. The next card I wanted to discuss is Elechik, the first Elestral on the list here. This card does something very unique in pinpoint searching your Divine Runes to add to hand, and seeing as Divine Runes are the linchpin of many strategies, it makes sense that you'd want to run up to 6 copies of it. Now, I do think there's an argument that Elechik is not a staple card because it really, as of right now, just helps out decks that want their Divine Rune, which is mostly just Nexus-based decks. So therefore, you can say, well, it's a staple card for Nexus-based strategies. But just searching on Divine Rune, those aren't exclusively Nexus support cards. They have their own effects. They can help out in other ways than just act as a Nexus bank. So I can see as we get more cards, future sets, that the use of Divine Runes will not be exclusive to Nexus-based decks, and thus Elechik will just be good for any deck that wants to search out their Divine Rune, not really limited to one strategy. So that's why I included it in this list. Currently in first edition, Elechik is run at 3 copies, and I think it makes sense. We've got such a limited card pool, less competition for deck slots, just making your deck as consistent as possible with such an integral card probably is what's best. However, I think moving forward, I could see Elechik dropping down to maybe 2 copies because deck spaces will become more competitive. Maybe just you don't need those 6 Divine Rune searches in your deck. Maybe there are other powerful cards that you can slot in as well, and the 1 copy of Elechik to make it 5 copies of your Divine Rune, or even the 1 copy of Elechik to make it 4 is good enough. So for the buyer's guide, I think 2 is fine in the long term, but for set 1, you will be definitely wanting 3. Thankfully, this card is pretty easily accessible, as you can pick up 2 copies in the Pantera starter deck, and it is a common in base set, meaning it's super easy to get. We got another Elestral in Vysceris here to talk about next. This card being able to spawn out another Vysceris is really strong right now because all the relevant removal is single target. Meaning that if you have the more buys you have on board, the more cards your opponent's going to have to commit to actually answer that board, making it more optimal than just going tall, because it takes more cards, it's harder to deal with. On top of that, it provides offensive pressure, so it has a lot of inherent value there, on top of just facilitating what looks to be the optimal game plan of going wide. And because its effect triggers when it destroys an Elestral in battle, this card's really going +2 because it minuses your opponent 1, which can be viewed as a +1 for yourself, and plus you 1 body on board. This card is also self-sufficient. It doesn't need any other support in the deck. You can easily just throw in 3 copies and a few Earth Spirits in your Spirit deck, and you don't even need an Earth Spirit to cast out the Vysceris. The 1 Vysceris summons off of its effect. It can be misenchanted for Ascension applications and Nexus. Decks right now run 3 copies, and it makes sense. You want as many opportunities to use Vysceris' effect as possible since it is so strong. As for the buyer's guide, I think 2 copies is fine. At least it gives you 1 use of Vysceris, and that's powerful enough, but I would not recommend 1 copy of it because at that point it's a pseudo 5 attacker, and at that point just run a 5 attacker that has a bonus effect. That's just way better. Right now, Vysceris is only a holo in first edition, and I expect it to be the most expensive as well as the most sought after due to the reasons I laid out earlier. I'd recommend waiting for the prices to die down as more people have product and are trying to sell it, but don't wait too long as the price will eventually climb back up, at least until we get a reprint. Speaking of reprints, we know it is going to be the Stained Glass Holo card in Shatterstar's Month 5 happening in June. That being said, because it is a holo in that pack and not guaranteed, I don't think it will be necessarily cheaper than the Holo Vysceris in first edition. It will definitely make it more accessible, but at the same time, it is more of a collector's kind of card. So if you're just looking for 1 more copy, I think it's fine to wait, but I wouldn't wait to pick up your playset until then. Just continue on the Elestrals train, we've got Astrabbit to talk about next. This card is probably the best Elestral in the game currently. When you cast it, it replaces itself, and that's already great. But not only does it replace itself, it's better than a draw 1 because you get the top 3 search, meaning you have options on what to pick, and your opponent still doesn't get that information on what it is. Just like I mentioned with Nectar of the Gods, it's extra consistency for your deck, and it's even better than Nog. Like, you don't have the options in hand, but you have the options on what to pick, and it's 1 more option, which is arguably better. On top of that, because it's on a receive effect, it's repeated consistency, whether it be synergy through Nexus or just re-enchanting it on the next turn. And to boot, it's just a big body. That 5 defense is really difficult to attack over with offensive Elestrals capping out at a 5 base attack without any other assistance from other cards. I mean, your opponent's going to have to use probably additional resources just to attack over it. Just like Vysceris is also self-sufficient, and arguably more so. Like, you can run any number of Astrabbits and a few Thunder Spirits in your Spirit deck, and you're good to go. It's really easy to splash it in really any strategy. Typically, it's run at 3 copies in decks just because it's so strong for all the reasons that I've outlined. It's also probably just the highest output card in such a limited format. As for my buyer's recommendation, you can really pick this up at any number of copies. As I said, you don't need multiple copies, it's self-reliant, but the more copies you have, the more consistent your deck is, the more likely you are to see it. So it is more optimal to pick up more copies. Thankfully, it is easily successful at 2 copies in the Imperial starter deck, 1 in the the Pantera starter deck, and it is an uncommon in first edition, meaning it's not too hard to find. The next card I have to talk about here is Resting on Your Laurels. In general, targeted removal is strong in games, and especially in a game like Elestrals where you can only cast one Elestral per turn without any other card effects, this becomes even more valuable. This card is also very cheap at 1 spirit, and your opponent's way to interact it has to be preemptive. They can't just respond to it within the same chain itself. They need to set up something on their turn or at the beginning of your turn, which is not ideal because then you still have the card to use anyway. They're just delaying the inevitable likely. The only thing I'd say holding back this card is the cast condition, meaning you cannot cast it while you're ahead, giving your opponent a chance to just set up, I don't know, big annoying dude that you really can't hit over. Like, you have to wait till they're ahead on board to be able to cast it, which it's still good. You can still easily get caught up on board, but if you're ahead, that's not ideal. It's kind of just a dead card in hand. On average, this card is run at 2 copies, but of note, there are plenty of decks that also max out at 3 copies, but there's also some decks that just don't run it at all. It does seem like it's very deck specific. You can easily get this card at 2 copies in the Pantera starter deck, and seeing as 2 copies is the average, I think that is perfectly fine. Also in month 2 of Shattered Stars, Resting on Your Laurels is getting a holo reprint, so that's a really easy place to pick up your 3rd copy if you do really want it. Poison Tipped Arrow, similarly to Resting on Your Laurels, is a staple card because it is targeted removal that your opponent has to preemptively prevent. But that is where the similarities end, as Poison Tipped Arrow is a counter rune, meaning you have to set it for a turn, meaning if your opponent has an Elestral out on board that you want to destroy, it's not going to cut it. However, that does mean that Poison Tipped Arrow can interact with your opponent's board on their turn, disrupting their offensive potential with that -2 attack. Though this is a catch-22 because if that -2 attack isn't enough to stop an attack over one of your Elestrals, or you have no Elestrals on board, that Elestral that you're PTA'd is still going to get value anyway. This card is typically run at 2 to 3 copies depending on how much the deck needs that removal. As for the buyer's guide, I think this card is safe to pick up at 2 copies, though I do think 3 is ideal to have at least for base set. I do question this card's future potential because the destruction is still really good, but as we start getting more counter runes introduced and just more cards in general, and deck spots become more competitive, will this card really hold up? Because it really is not ideal into some offensive boards as some of the other options, which we will discuss later on this list. And will future options also be more ideal? We'll just have to wait and see. Right now, this card is only available at 2 copies in the Centaur starter deck, though I think it will be getting a holo reprint in month 5 of Shattered Stars in June. I think Earthquake is a more apt comparison to Resting on Your Laurels, as it is targeted removal on an Invoke rune that your opponent has to preemptively set up something to prevent. Where this card differs in Laurels is not having that casting condition, meaning you can play it from ahead as well as behind. And I think that's huge, especially when a lot of the decks are staying lower to the ground at that 4 to 5 attack range. You don't want an Astrabbit stopping you, so being able to just Earthquake it out of the way and continue your offense is super valuable. The cost of this card over Laurels is one that I cost 2 spirits, but I think that is kind of negligible for this discussion, but rather that it requires you to run at least 2 Earth spirits, if not 4 if you want to max out this card. But as of right now, with deck slots being the least competitive, as well as spirit deck slots being the least competitive they ever will be, it's real easy to justify slotting a powerful card such as this in. Typically, this card is run at 3 copies for the aforementioned reasons. With this card being so self-sufficient, just pick up as many copies as you can. A whole playset is ideal, but as long as you can get 1 to 2 copies, that's better than none. This card is easily accessible at 2 copies in the Centaur starter deck, 1 copy in the Trifernal starter deck, 2 copies in the Imperial starter deck, as well as an uncommon in base set. I'm really curious to see how the usage of this card changes over time, especially as we get future sets and the other 3 elements introduced into the game. As I mentioned, deck slots right now are the least competitive they ever will be, but in the future, that will change, and I'm curious if how much decks will really want to commit almost a 5th of their spirits just towards being able to run Earthquake. Shield of Achilles is unique in that it's the only non-targeting removal currently. That's probably the least important factor of why this card is a staple, only really being relevant against Full Tempest. What does make this card a staple is it being able to interrupt an attack and bounce the Elestral back to hand, which is great for tempo. You still do need to deal with that Elestral, but if you time it just right and give yourself more time to find answers or just set yourself up in a position that's way better to answer it, that's totally worth it. On top of that, it can interrupt powerful when destroyed effects such as Vysceris, or when destroyed in battle effects that can be found on cards like Foamy and Hydrake. This card is typically run at 3 copies as the premier way to interrupt an attack as well as get advantage on board. Just like Earthquake, this card is ideal to pick up at as many copies as you can, completely self-sufficient, so if you can get even 1 or 2, that is a-okay, but aim for that playset. This card is very easy to get with the Majesty and Imperial Star deck each having 2 copies, and it coming in an uncommon in the base set. This card is also a holo in Shatterstars Month 1, so it should not be difficult to find. The other reason to try to pick up your playset is I expect that non-targeting aspect of Shield to be more relevant as we get future support waves. Moving into our final 3 cards here, starting off we got Ambrosia. This card is a staple because it's not only 2 extra life that you get, it is 2 extra resources to cast cards, which can really convert into 1 or even 2 extra cards you get to play over the course of the game. This is especially important in base set because the games are so grindy right now. There really isn't much explosive turns that exist right now. So really just being able to outlast your opponent by a little bit, being able to play that extra card or 2 over them can be the difference between winning and losing. This card also can correct your spirits, making it easier to mix and match your elements in a single deck and not have to max out the spirits to be able to play all copies of a card. You just have to find an Ambrosia and you can easily recover those spirits. This is going to be a common thing throughout the rest of this video. Pick up 3 copies of this card if you can. 1 or 2 copies is better than none. Thankfully, just like Nectar of the Gods, this card is easily accessible in all the star decks at 1 to 2 copies, and it is a holo rare in base set currently. And on top of that, it is one of these stellar promos in the blister packs, so getting a playset should be a breeze. I'm also curious to see how this card's usage trends in future sets because I could see a case where decks are just so explosive in the future, you don't want to use a whole card just to recover 1/10 of your total life. But at the same time, just how this game's set up, just being able to play an extra card or 2 may be worth it enough to warrant this card just throughout the lifetime of the game, or well into the foreseeable future at least. The second to last card we have here is Tsunami, and this card's a staple because it's the only one that can stop multiple attacks, and it's really cheap to boot. This card for 1 spirit, if you're not up against a water deck or a deck running water spirits, can pretty much just say your turn ends here. And this is on top of it being flexible, where you don't necessarily need to stop all your opponent's attacks. If you're up against water and you're not running a primary water deck, you can easily, for instance, if your opponent's attacking with the Galaxy, you've got an Astrabbit in attack position, cast your Tsunami, switch Astrabbit to defense, and your opponent's Galaxy will just kind of bounce off of it. And if they don't have something bigger on board, that again stops their battle phase. This card is typically run at 3 copies and it's not hard to see why, as also the position removal is really strong for counteroffensive, because if you're switching all your opponent's high offense Elestrals to defense position, likely that's their lower stat, which you can more easily run over. Pick up as many copies of this card as you can. Playset's ideal, though this card is also independent of other copies and other cards, meaning 1 or 2 copies is better than none. This card is easily accessible at 1 copy in the Trifernal Star deck, 2 copies in the Majesty and Pantera Star deck, as well as an uncommon in base set. Finally, the last card I have to talk about here is Gorgon's Gaze. This card does a lot, probably the most out of any card in the game right now, and it's super versatile. Being able to negate and suppress Elestrals, stop attacks, interrupt Nexus, prevent Ascensions. The applications of this card will only become wider as we get more interesting Elestrals and effects. Currently, nothing else can just blanketly negate an Elestrals effect quite like this card, barring targeting protection of course, but that's only on Voltempest right now. Oh, and an Empowered Bag of Winds, don't want to forget about that. On top of that, this card has no condition. I mean, you can freely use it, and that really opens up the applications of this card. Like, there's so many examples I could go over, but I think a good, more nuanced example to give, or really 2 that I have here, are when your opponent attacks in with, say, a Vysceris into your 4 or 5 attack Elestral. During the battle step, you can flip up Gorgon's Gaze. It doesn't stop the attack because the attack is already happening, but you suppress the Vysceris' effect, dropping back down to 4 attack, meaning your 5 attack Elestral destroys it, or the 4 attack Elestral just causes it to crash, getting rid of both of them. You can also get really creative if, say, you have a Galaxy out, your opponent casts out a Molstation and uses that attack swap effect to attack Molstation with 6 attack into your Galaxy. In the battle step, flip up Gorgon's Gaze, use it on your own Galaxy, and all of a sudden that effect goes away, meaning you're at 2 attack to the Molstation's 1. This card's typically run at 3 copies for all the aforementioned reasons. Get this card at as many copies as you can, just like I've been saying with all the other ones. 1 and 2 is fine, 3 is ideal. This card can only be found in the Trifernal Star deck at 2 copies, so you will need to pick up 2 star decks to be able to get your full playset. Though, if you're fine waiting and taking a little bit of a risk here, I'm guessing that month 6 of Shatterstars in July will have the Gorgon's Gaze in Holo, because it is the fire one, and we've seen kind of those similar patterns with Resting Laurels being in the Wind Shatterstars pack, Shield being in the Thunder one, but it's not confirmed at this point, so do this at your own risk. And that is all the cards I wanted to discuss in this video. I want to highlight the disclaimer I gave at the beginning of this video again, that this list was in no particular order in terms of what you should prioritize. If you want to get an opinion on what you should, just go into the Discord server, ask around, give what deck you're trying to build, what your general playstyle is. You can even at me, Eagle the Duck there, and I can help you with that. But now I want to hear from you all. Are there any cards that were not on this list that you think will be a staple? Maybe not even in first edition, but in future sets. And if you've enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell so you're notified when I do upload more content. But with that being said though, look forward to more content coming out real soon.